Okay, so here is the audio lecture for Good Guys with Guns, Hegemonic Masculinity and Concealed Handguns. So, the text talks about how guns are often used as symbols of masculinity, especially in our culture. So, right now there's an estimated 6 million people in the US that possess a concealed handgun license. This means that they have the legal right to carry a concealed firearm in most public places. The vast majority of concealed license or handgun license holders are men, and men are more likely than women to support concealed handgun licensing. In this research, they're trying to examine the gender dynamics that shape the motives of men who are licensed to carry. So, the gun has become a symbol of masculinity, of power, of force, aggressiveness, decisiveness, deadly accuracy, cold rationality. In the research, they're looking at how masculinity motivates law-abiding men in their use of concealed handguns. So to examine the motives of men who have a concealed handgun license, they use this term, hegemonic masculinity, to understand the societal notions of masculinity at play in their decisions. The term explains the discursive practices and embodied dispositions that legitimize male domination. So she argues that by having a license, economically privileged white men can define themselves in contrast to femininity and in contrast to alternative versions of masculinity that are vilified or ridiculed. So by doing so, they reinforce white male privilege in society in general. So that's why they kind of use the term hegemonic masculinity, the dominant form of masculinity. So some men see their gun carrying as central to what it means to be a good husband and father who can protect his wife and children from danger. And for older men who fear they're losing their ability to physically dominate others, concealed firearms can act as a totem to boost their confidence when they have interactions with other men. So they see their own gun carrying as noble and just and attribute violence to others, especially, racialized others. So, specifically Black and Latino men. So in the research, they had three main themes that they were looking at: how firearms contribute to cultural constructions of masculinity, how organizations such as the NRA utilize masculine tropes to mobilize membership, and how masculinity is implicated in the violent acts in which firearms are used. So how can you see the gendered aspects within the violence itself? So for the first theme, firearm use and gender, the relationship between firearms violence and masculinity in fantasy life is important to understanding, the kind of notions that drive people to get these concealed handgun licenses. So our culture celebrates violence. We celebrate aggression, we celebrate war, which can be seen in films like Rambo, right? Which is kind of the, they drew first blood, kind of like extreme version of that. But, growing up watching all that crap as a kid, I'm kind of like soaked all that crap up. But, this encompasses what they call the warrior ethos. So meaning that we justify violence and killing as a masculine pursuit. And it's not coincidental that these films emerged on the cultural landscape after the US was defeated in Vietnam. So soldiers were celebrated in films as ideal warriors, but it was this extension of the larger cultural shift that linked masculinity to physical toughness. So to be a man, you have to exhibit physical control of your space, to be able to act on bodies or objects within your space. And with this post-Vietnam media version, what emerged was a more militarized version of masculinity, right? Like, if you watch like any of those kind of like Rambo, Die Hard-ish kind of stuff from that time period, let's just say there's lots of guns. There's lots of clips. Actually, my favorite when I was a kid watching all that crap was the A-Team, which I just loved remarking upon. It was like all about for the ammunitions industry because they never actually hit anyone, but they shot like 200,000 bullets like every 5 seconds. Anyway, I'll just talk about that if you let me. So anyway, so this kind of narrative, I guess, of celebrating militarized versions of masculinity, it popularized the use of guns for personal defense. So this led to a proliferation of paramilitary organizations and contributed to the popularity of similar war games such as paintball. So just a side note, paramilitary organizations, something I think is just fascinating that I learned actually when I was an undergrad. I did this program through the Student Learning Institute, which I suggest They have it through ASI at the TSU. Sorry, as many acronyms as I can squeeze into one sentence. But I did this social justice leadership training through there, and it was rad. But through that, there was this presentation from the Southern Poverty Law Center talking about hate groups and the rise of kind of the alt-right, and this was like 10 years ago, somewhere in there. Anyway, so, well, maybe not, but yeah, somewhere in there. And basically, they were kind of talking about how what used to be a very centrally organized white supremacist movement actually kind of splintered in recent years and has formed into these paramilitary groups. So there's all these like militias, like men that have like armed kind of paramilitary forces, not to even mention all of the corporate paramilitary forces, like kind of like the Blackwater-ish mercenary people that are typically ex, um, you know, military people that are paid to kind of, instead of going to like, fight a war, you're like going to defend a person or a pipeline or a thing like, anyway, whatever. So anyway, these paramilitary organizations, just like ignoring the corporate ones for a minute, these kind of like heartland of America groups, a lot of these white supremacist groups kind of splintered and have now started looking into stockpiling guns and becoming trained militarily for what they consider to be some sort of future race war, which is crazy because that's literally what Charles Manson thought. So that's how you know it's crazy. Anyway, just side note, I thought you should be like really concerned about that. The Southern Poverty Law Centers kind of tracks hate groups, and they've really been looking at, it's not just that these people hate, but now they're training themselves as military people and they have the majority of guns. Anyway, so willingness to engage in violence is central to meanings of masculinity. So because real men must show others they're not afraid, they have to engage in violence to prove they're not afraid. So few men have culturally legitimate occasions to express the violence that is in these violent fantasies that they talk about to their interviewers. So they promote this new war ethos where power, force, and might are celebrated. These are socially necessary, right? Because you're protecting good people from evil. So firearms, in this view, give good guys strength, power, and moral right to defend the world from the bad guys. Or, in Wayne LaPierre, that NRA douche's statement, what was it? The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? Literally that narrative. So this fantasy of using guns to fight bad guys, so most of the people that carry these concealed weapons won't actually have a chance to use it, even as a performance, even to flash it at somebody, right? But it doesn't have to be based in reality. Instead, it must express these widespread ideals, fantasies, and desires that justify that dominance over femininity, right? The masculinity of carrying a gun with you, knowing you can exert your power. So the gun lobby has their own role in this. They try to link guns with those dominant forms of masculinity we have in the culture. So they've been actively producing meanings of masculinity as it works to expand gun rights, even in the face of public outcry over the danger of guns. So, even like the week after we have these crazy school shootings, you still have the NRA out there talking about security and family values, individual freedom. So the gun lobby works to make masculinity a principal theme of gun ownership. Hopefully, trying to tie gun ownership to gender identity. So, research has explored how the NRA exploits these popular understandings of guns as masculine symbols to mobilize their members. And they found that gun ownership is associated in NRA discourse with self-reliance, rugged individualism, and a strong work ethic. These are traits that, Meltzer, the researcher, calls frontier masculinity. So these narratives appeal to the working and middle-class white men who are threatened by the civil rights and feminist movements and queer rights movements that are kind of pushing in on their assumed dominance. So there's this publication called The American Rifleman that comes from the NRA that, among other things, tells stories of violent crimes that are thwarted by private citizens that use guns. So one of the examples they give in the book is that this man's woken up in the middle of the night by his kids who say there's two people breaking into the home. So he grabs his gun, he shoots one, he holds the other at gunpoint until the police arrive. So most of the victims in the stories, though, are women, the elderly, or in some way disabled or in failing health. So these people are considered classically vulnerable. which heightens the narrative structure of the stories because they're able to achieve masculinity with firearms. So, though defensive gun statistics are pretty rare, right? The NRA is able to tell these stories in its monthly publication to circulate stories of real life heroes who use guns to defend the defenseless. So, when it comes to use of firearms, how most of these studies are really focused on alternative or marginalized masculinities as to how men actually use firearms. So they usually look at criminal behavior, and some consider criminal behavior as an attempt by some of these marginalized men to accomplish masculinity because they're not able to do so in legitimate ways. Like by making a lot of money or any of those kind of other things we value men for in the culture. So in looking at males who commit school shootings, all or most of the shooters had tales of being harassed or, gay baited, and for inadequate gender performance was typically why they were mocked or humiliated. So by using firearms to commit these acts of violence, these boys attempt to move from margin to center, from being the wimp who was picked on to the aggressor who dominated and controlled others. So guns also provide gang members with a sense of power, and guns help gang members project a tough image because the reputation of both gang and the individual gang member are determined by their willingness to defend their honor and be seen as masculine. So this really comes into play when it comes to gun violence of neighboring groups shooting back and forth at each other. Because, if you don't retaliate, then, you're then considered someone that's a pushover. So there's a lot of gaps in existing research in the way that guns factor into cultural constructions of masculinity and how hegemonic masculinity operates. So these other research things with how men use guns have focused on people that were mostly in jail. So it really hasn't looked at how this relates to people that are non-deviant. So on a regional level, guns factor heavily in displays of masculine violence that are celebrated in action films through fantasies of good guys killing bad guys. So the gun lobby taps into this and links it with American values. Since the research is focused on the deviant, this is different because it contrasts it with those that have concealed permits, which to even get one, you have to be law-abiding. So they found this theme of family defense. So defending the family is significant in men's accounts of carrying a concealed firearm. Nearly all the men interviewed were married and had children living at home with them, and they explained their gun use is deeply tied to defending their families. So there's this weird disconnect, though, where, this one participant, Adam, talked about how it was important to have a gun at all times. And part of his role as father was to, have this kind of way to protect his wife. Because, basically he said it was because he's physically stronger than her, which really doesn't make sense because it's a gun, but whatever. But his argument was rooted in this bodily difference, which makes the distinction seem natural and inevitable that he should be in charge of the kind of violence on behalf of that. But the fact that she doesn't need to carry one doesn't really diminish how she is as a parent. So, in addition to being a tool for self-defense, possession of a concealed handgun license signifies that he's a good father and husband. So it's considered a superior tool because it's an equalizer. Like what Eazy-E said, right? With a gun, it doesn't matter if you're smaller or bigger, right? But you would think this would also apply to women, right? And some men did want their wives to also carry a gun, but they didn't think of their wife as a bad mother if she chose not to carry a gun, while most linked it to their role as fathers and husbands. So many use this discourse to link masculinity and physicality together and link femininity to vulnerability, right? So men have to protect women. So these men consider themselves law-abiding, virtuous, and brave defenders of their families, which match the image of the ideal gun owner perpetuated by the NRA. Paradoxically, carrying a concealed firearm does not actually enable them to defend their families. Plus, the fathers interviewed recognize that they are not always present and realize if their wife, is it would actually make more sense for their wife to carry the gun than for them because their wife is more likely to be with the kids, would be, victimized in this kind of world that we equate femininity to vulnerability, right? So that, while the gun is associated with masculinity, it does not translate into an ability to protect his family. So while they may not be able to carry out these fantasies of violence, the concealed handguns suggest to them that they could if they wanted to. So they see themselves as brave leaders of their family, and the concealed carry license is an important symbol that allows them to construct this hegemonic masculinity for themselves. So it means in many ways it's the ideal symbol because it tells them they're good husbands and fathers even when they're not with their families. So few respondents younger than 40 said that they needed a gun to defend themselves. So Jeff was one of the examples, said that, he wasn't as young as he used to be, that carrying a gun made him feel relaxed, knowing that he has a superior ability to deal with situations harshly if he has to. So he tells a story of how a coworker feared him and how it made him feel proud. And, this carrying a gun kind of gave him the confidence that he used to have in his youth that came from his ability to do martial arts, right? But now that he was older and more, infirm, he used the gun as that equalizer. And then another responding, Gil, talked about how, quote, "I refuse to be a victim," and like how they were using it to defend themselves in that way. So willingness to engage in violence and being capable of domination are traits that are deeply tied to masculinity. So though these men say their guns are simply tools to prevent victimization, they are also symbols of virility, which carries impacts on how they see themselves as men. So basically, they're just reassuring themselves that they're not going to be victims. So the gun in that way functions as a totem of masculinity. So it gives these men calm assurance that they can defend themselves against attack despite their aging bodies. Another theme they found was dangerous neighborhoods. So 11 men interviewed said they carry a gun wherever it's legally allowed, and 9 said they make decisions based on where they go. So they will carry a firearm if they go somewhere they have never been, if they're traveling out of town, or if they're in a, quote, dangerous part of town with a reputation. So one of the respondents kept using Compton as a euphemism, right? So really using it as a code for a space he sees as a predominantly poor black neighborhood that he identifies as dangerous and scary, right? He also used gangster as coded language, kind of linking blackness to criminality. So, if you see all black men as potential criminals, then you can put violence, aggression, and criminal intent on the black men you encounter. So these men that were interviewed feel comfortable in predominantly white spaces. And so by putting a gun in their waistband, they can overcome the fear of the criminal other that restricts their behavior or movement in non-white spaces. So this kind of leads to what they call gender racism. So meaning that their narratives both validate inequality and contrast black masculinity with white masculinity as a hegemonic ideal. So whiteness is important to these dynamics because to them, whiteness signifies nothing at all, meaning nothing of concern, right? Only thing you're concerned about is who are those people of color and what are they up to? So, what they found basically is that concealed handguns prove profoundly meaningful in the reproduction of hegemonic masculinity, that men can position themselves as defenders of their family and as embodiments of the American virtues of self-reliance, strength, and courage. And of course, there's law-abiding requirements to getting these licenses. So you can only get the license if you do not have a criminal record. So being a good guy, quote unquote, is important to these men's constructions of themselves as righteous husbands and fathers. Many of the men interviewed have elaborate fantasies of potential violence at the hands of other men. So because the body capacity for aggression and violence is central to what it means to be masculine, some of the older men felt that their masculinity was diminished, which Kimmel argues goes to the roots of male fear, that another man is going to emasculate you and show you that you don't measure up to what it means to be a real man. So the gun can boost this waning confidence. He can regain this sense of masculinity where men dominate each other. So this leads to the specter of the black criminal. So the men that ascribe a violent masculinity to men of color construct a sense of themselves as contradictory or different from them. They assume that the black men they encounter are armed and dangerous. So, gang members and other marginal men also use guns in similar ways, but with different implications. So they both assert control and dominance. That's really the goal of both of these sets of men, that they feel empowered through their masculine performance of domination. But for gang members, it really more reflects their marginalization. It's not like they have other opportunities to kind of show their power in society, right? If you're broke, if you're a racial minority, if you're kind of considered deviant, then you really don't have that kind of way to assert control and power in society. So, contrasting their experiences with the law-abiding men, you see that there's some privilege that comes with concealed carrying permits. So it takes a lot of money and a clean record to carry a concealed firearm. So they already have access to the culturally celebrated versions of masculinity, as most of them were white, middle, or upper class males that were heterosexual. So they already have kind of the leg up, so to speak, in society. So it's really kind of a different way to assert one's masculinity than for the marginalized men. So they argue that future research should consider men of color who have concealed carry permits, like how do they deal with the perception that they're criminals? And also to fully understand how gender shapes the experiences of carrying a concealed handgun. The case of women license holders should also be considered in future research.